6 months into living in Maple Ridge, my family became her newest project. She marched onto our lawn wearing a laminated badge nobody had ever seen. Neighbors froze, phones out, waiting to see what HOA Officer Voss would do next. I stayed calm, held my daughter's hand, and said nothing at all. Something in her voice cracked, just for a second, like she already knew. Across the street, a car door slammed shut, and she flinched. She had no idea who was walking up the driveway behind her. By nightfall, everyone in Maple Ridge would know her name for the wrong reason. My name is Emily Carter, and 2 years ago my husband Jake and I bought our first home in Maple Ridge Estates, a quiet subdivision outside Charlotte. We moved in with our daughter Sophie, then 3 years old, chasing the kind of stability new parents dream about: a yard, good schools, friendly neighbors, and finally, a little peace. Jake traveled often for work, something in compliance. He always said with a tired smile, leaving Sophie and me to handle most of daily life alone. I didn't mind. Our neighbors waved, and for the first time in years, I believed we'd finally found somewhere we could simply be happy. It didn't take long to meet Deborah Voss, Debbie to some, the HOA officer to everyone else. She walked the neighborhood most mornings with a clipboard, a laminated badge clipped to her blouse, and an expression that suggested she was personally responsible for the value of every home on the street. Neighbors mentioned her carefully, in hushed tones over fences, the way you'd warn someone about a strict substitute teacher. Just follow the rules, one woman told me during our first week, and you'll never hear from her. I laughed it off. I had no idea how wrong that reassurance would turn out to be. Our first real interaction happened over our mailbox. Debbie stopped mid-walk, tapped it twice with a pen, and informed me the black paint was technically 2 shades off approved association standard. I nodded politely, assuming this was simply how HOA life worked. I didn't yet understand how far she'd push things. I asked a neighbor, Pam, who genuinely seemed the friendly community type, about the HOA board itself. She shrugged and said most members had quietly stopped attending meetings years ago, leaving Debbie as the only consistent voice, self-appointed, unelected in practice, but treated like law by everyone too tired to argue. That detail stuck with me, though at the time it seemed harmless. An overzealous volunteer wasn't exactly a crisis. I told Jake about her on the phone that night, and he laughed, joking that every neighborhood needed one self-appointed sheriff. Neither of us imagined how literally that description would later apply. Within weeks, Sophie's sidewalk chalk drawings became a target. Debbie left a printed notice taped to our door citing unauthorized exterior markings, despite chalk washing away within a day of rain. I peeled it off, confused, and asked another neighbor if this was normal. She simply said, "Welcome to Debbie's world." I noticed a pattern quickly. Some houses broke obvious rules: faded paint, overgrown lawns, parked boats, yet received no notices at all. Meanwhile, our home, freshly painted and carefully maintained, kept collecting violation slips for things so minor they bordered on absurd. Selective enforcement, though I didn't have proof yet. Pam mentioned, almost in passing, that Debbie had run for HOA president 2 years earlier and lost badly. Yet somehow, she still acted with full authority, attending every meeting, issuing every notice, speaking for a board that rarely showed up. Something about that didn't sit right with me, but I let it go. Our daughter's small plastic swing set arrived that spring, a birthday gift from Jake's parents. Within 2 days, a notice appeared demanding its removal, citing unauthorized structures visible from the street. I checked our HOA handbook myself. Nothing prohibited swing sets. I began to suspect Debbie was inventing rules as she went. I tried reasoning with her directly one afternoon, catching her mid-walk near our driveway. She smiled thinly, told me rules were rules, and reminded me that new families often needed extra guidance adjusting to community standards. Something about her tone felt less like enforcement and more like a personal message. Jake, home briefly between trips, listened to the swing set story and frowned. Ask her which bylaw exactly, he said, ever precise even off duty. When I brought it up again, Debbie couldn't cite a specific rule, only repeating community standards like a phrase memorized rather than understood or actually documented anywhere. Other parents on the street quietly admitted their own children's play equipment had somehow avoided notices entirely. One woman, Carol, said her family had simply ignored Debbie's letters for years with no consequences. That inconsistency planted the first real seed of doubt. Was Debbie's authority as absolute as she claimed? I began saving every notice she left us, tucking them into a folder out of habit more than strategy. Jake, always cautious with documentation from his work life, encouraged it during one of our calls. Paper trails matter, he said simply. I didn't yet know how important that folder would become. Debbie's visits grew more frequent that summer, always timed for when Jake was traveling. She seemed to know his schedule better than casual observation should allow, appearing during exactly the weeks he was gone, as though she'd been quietly studying our routines the same way she studied everyone else's yards. One Tuesday, she cornered me at the mailbox again, this time mentioning Sophie by name, commenting on how young children can be so disruptive to a community's image. The comment left me unsettled, less about lawn care policy and more like a warning wrapped in the language of neighborhood etiquette. I confided in Pam about the strange comment, and her expression shifted, careful and guarded. She had a daughter once, Pam said quietly. Moved away young. Doesn't come around anymore. She wouldn't elaborate further, but the sentence lingered with me longer than any HOA notice ever had. I didn't push Pam for details, sensing she'd already said more than she meant to. Instead, I focused on the practical problem in front of me. A growing stack of dubious violation notices, an increasingly personal tone from Debbie, and a husband whose travel schedule she seemed unusually well informed about. By midsummer, the notices escalated from paint and chalk to fines, $25 here, $50 there, always addressed formally, always citing bylaws I couldn't locate in any official document the association had ever distributed to homeowners. I began requesting copies of the actual HOA bylaws, a request Debbie repeatedly ignored. When I finally reached an actual board member by phone, an elderly man named Harold, he sounded surprised I even had questions. Debbie handles most of that, he said vaguely, admitting he hadn't attended a meeting in over a year. The board existed mostly on paper and Debbie's word. That call confirmed what Pam had hinted at weeks earlier. Debbie wasn't merely an enthusiastic volunteer. She was functioning as judge, jury, and enforcer of an association that had quietly stopped supervising her, handing informal power to someone the neighborhood had actually voted against giving any authority at all. I started noticing her car slow rolling past our house at odd hours. Always brief, always explainable on the surface, checking mail, walking a dog she didn't own. Community patrol, as she once called it aloud to another homeowner. It felt less like oversight and more like surveillance, though I had no proof. Jake came home for a rare full weekend and watched Debbie's routine himself, unimpressed and quietly analytical, the way I imagined he approached difficult cases at work. "She's building a pattern," he said, almost to himself. "The question is what she's building it toward." I didn't understand yet what he meant. By late summer, our violation folder had grown thick, our patience thin, and our neighborhood's quiet, welcoming feel had curdled into something watchful and tense. I still believed, foolishly, that reasoning or documentation alone would resolve things. I had no idea Debbie was about to escalate far beyond paperwork entirely. The real spark came on a Saturday morning when Debbie parked directly behind Jake's truck in our driveway, blocking him in, and announced she was documenting an unauthorized commercial vehicle, a plain gray pickup with no markings whatsoever, used for nothing but grocery runs and school drop-offs. Jake, exhausted from a red-eye flight the night before, tried explaining calmly that the truck was personal, not commercial. Debbie refused to move her car, insisting she needed photographic evidence first. Sophie, watching from the porch, asked why the scary lady wouldn't let Daddy leave. Debbie heard her and smiled coldly. The confrontation drew neighbors outside. Phones raised, murmuring the way small crowds do when they sense something's about to happen. Jake stayed remarkably composed, something I'd later understand wasn't accidental. Debbie, sensing an audience, doubled down, threatening a formal violation report and hinting at towing consequences within the week. That evening, an official-looking letter arrived, citing repeated commercial vehicle violations and threatening a lien against our home if unresolved. I read it 3 times, stomach tightening. Liens were serious, permanent marks on property records. Jake read it once, set it down, and said only, "She just made a mistake." I didn't understand his calm at first, assuming exhaustion or denial. He explained that HOAs couldn't legally lien a property over a personal vehicle dispute without documented bylaw violations and proper board approval, something Debbie clearly hadn't secured, given Harold's earlier admission about the board's near-total absence from any oversight. Still, the threat rattled me enough to call a local attorney friend, Rachel, for advice. She confirmed Jake's read immediately, adding that self-appointed compliance officers issuing lien threats without board authorization sometimes crossed from overzealous into legally actionable territory. I began to realize this wasn't just an annoying neighbor anymore. Debbie's behavior shifted further after that confrontation, growing sharper, more personal. She stopped pretending politeness during our brief encounters, addressing me directly about certain families who didn't respect community standards. Sophie's toys, our trash can placement, even our porch light timing, everything became fresh ammunition for new complaints. One afternoon, she left a note specifically mentioning Sophie playing unsupervised in our fenced backyard, visible only from Debbie's own property across the cul-de-sac. The implication unsettled me deeply. She'd been watching closely enough to see into our backyard, timing her observations around exactly when I stepped inside briefly. I mentioned this to Pam, who grew quiet again, then admitted something new. Debbie had once called authorities on another family years earlier over a similarly vague, unsupervised child complaint. One that turned out completely baseless after an investigation. The family moved away within months, unable to shake the stress. That story lodged itself in my chest like a stone. I started keeping Sophie closer, not out of genuine concern for her safety, but from fear of what Debbie might report next. It was exhausting, feeling surveilled in my own backyard, adjusting my parenting around one neighbor's need for control. Jake, hearing all this over the phone, grew quieter than usual. The tone he used when something serious was forming behind his composed exterior. "Keep documenting everything," he said. "Times, dates, exactly what she says. Don't engage more than necessary." I didn't ask why he sounded so certain something bigger was coming. The following week, Debbie appeared at our door directly, clipboard in hand, informing me she'd be recommending a formal hearing regarding our pattern of violations. I asked, as calmly as I could, who exactly would conduct this hearing, given the board's near-total absence. Her answer was vague, defensive, oddly rehearsed. I requested, in writing, official documentation of her authority to issue fines, liens, or hearings on the association's behalf. She promised to forward the paperwork, a promise that, like so many before it, quietly evaporated into nothing over the following days, replaced instead by yet another minor violation notice. Around this time, our elderly neighbor Harold mentioned during a brief chat that Debbie had recently opened a separate bank account for HOA administrative purposes, something he vaguely recalled approving in a meeting he could no longer clearly remember attending. The comment struck me as strange, though I couldn't say exactly why yet. I filed that detail away alongside everything else, unsure how it connected but certain it mattered somehow. Rachel, my attorney friend, suggested requesting full financial records from the association, a homeowner's legal right in most HOA structures, regardless of how informally the current leadership actually operated day to day. My written request for financial records went unanswered for 2 full weeks, then was met with a curt reply claiming records were under review following a supposed accounting update. Something about the delay felt less like bureaucracy and more like someone scrambling to organize numbers before anyone looked too closely. Meanwhile, Debbie's public comments about our family grew bolder. At a community gathering I attended without Jake, she loudly mentioned certain households bending rules while others struggled to keep up, staring pointedly in my direction. A few neighbors exchanged glances. Nobody spoke up, though I sensed shared discomfort in the silence. Afterward, a woman I hadn't met, Nina, quietly approached me and admitted she'd faced similar treatment 2 years earlier over a fence color dispute, eventually paying a fine simply to make Debbie stop showing up at her house. "It's easier to comply," Nina said, "than to fight someone who never stops." That mindset, comply rather than fight, seemed to explain why Debbie had operated unchecked for so long. Most neighbors simply paid, apologized, or moved on, unwilling to invest energy contesting someone who treated every interaction like a battle for absolute authority over the neighborhood's smallest details. I wasn't willing to simply comply, not after the lien threat, not after Sophie's name being invoked in complaints, Not after learning about the family who'd moved away years earlier. Something in me shifted from anxious to determined, even without fully understanding yet what I was actually building toward. Jake came home again that weekend, and together we reviewed every notice, every fine, every strange comment, laying them chronologically across our kitchen table. The pattern, once organized, looked less like overzealous rule enforcement and more like a deliberate, sustained campaign specifically targeting our family for reasons still unclear to me. "There's something personal in this," Jake said finally, tapping the swing set notice, the backyard complaint, the comments about Sophie. "This isn't about bylaws." I agreed, though neither of us could yet explain why a woman we'd barely known for months seemed so fixated on tearing our small family down. That night, lying awake, I thought about Pam's comment weeks earlier. Debbie's daughter, moved away young, never mentioned again. I didn't know if it connected to us at all, but the coincidence nagged at me, a loose thread I couldn't stop quietly pulling at in the dark. The formal hearing Debbie promised turned out to be nothing more than her sitting alone at a folding table in the clubhouse, reading a prepared statement to an empty room except for me, Jake joining by speakerphone, and Harold, who seemed as confused about the proceedings' legitimacy as we were. She presented printed meeting minutes, citing board approval for our fines, dated weeks earlier. Harold squinted at the page, then admitted quietly he didn't recall that particular meeting happening at all, despite his signature appearing at the bottom, shaky and unfamiliar even to his own eyes. I felt something click into place watching his confusion. Either Harold's memory was failing badly, or that signature hadn't come from him honestly. I said nothing yet, filing the observation away carefully, unwilling to accuse without proof, though suspicion now sat heavy and unmistakable in my chest. Debbie pressed forward regardless, formally recommending our fines increase to $200 monthly until compliance issues were resolved, plus continued threat of a lien filing. I asked, directly, for a copy of the original meeting minutes with authentic signatures. She promised, again, to follow up soon. That night, Jake called Rachel directly, walking her through everything, the fake-seeming minutes, Harold's confusion, the mounting fines. Rachel's tone sharpened noticeably. "That's not overzealous anymore," she said. "That's potentially fraud." The word landed heavily between us, turning an annoying dispute into something far more serious. 2 days later, I arrived home to find Jake's truck missing from the driveway, replaced by an empty space and a small orange sticker on the curb. It had been towed, allegedly for a violation Debbie had personally reported, despite the truck sitting in our own private driveway the entire time. Retrieving it cost nearly $400 in fees, money we hadn't budgeted for and shouldn't have owed at all. The tow company's paperwork listed Debbie's name as the authorizing contact, using HOA letterhead that, upon closer inspection, didn't match any official association documents Harold had ever seen distributed before. Furious but controlled, I photographed everything, the tow receipt, the letterhead, the curb sticker, adding it all to our growing folder. Jake, hearing the story over the phone, went unusually quiet, the specific quiet I now recognized as him mentally building a case rather than simply feeling angry. I started talking to more neighbors directly, no longer content with quiet sympathy exchanged over fences. Nina introduced me to two other families who'd faced similar escalating fines and mysterious towing incidents, all conveniently occurring while their own vehicles sat legally parked on private property they clearly owned. A pattern emerged quickly. Families who'd pushed back against Debbie's authority, even mildly, seemed to receive harsher, stranger treatment than those who simply complied. It felt less like community management and more like retaliation, specifically targeted, specifically personal, against anyone unwilling to accept her word as final. I began compiling everyone's stories, dates, and documentation into a shared file, an idea Rachel suggested when I mentioned how many similar experiences kept surfacing. "If this is a pattern," she said, "you'll need more than your own story to prove it convincingly to anyone who might investigate." Meanwhile, Debbie seemed to sense growing resistance, showing up at our house twice in 1 week, each visit slightly more aggressive than the last. She mentioned, almost casually, that families who cause trouble sometimes find the community isn't the right fit for them, a comment that felt unmistakably like a threat. I recorded that conversation on my phone, something Jake had quietly encouraged weeks earlier once Rachel confirmed our state allowed one-party consent recording. Debbie's exact words, her tone, the implied threat against our family's place in the neighborhood, all of it captured clearly, undeniably, for the first time. That recording changed something in me. I stopped feeling like a confused new homeowner navigating unclear rules and started feeling like someone documenting a genuine pattern of abuse. One Rachel confirmed could eventually support both civil action and, depending on specifics, a formal complaint to local authorities. Jake's travel schedule, meanwhile, remained mysteriously well known to Debbie despite us never publicly discussing it. I began wondering whether someone close to us was quietly relaying information, an unsettling thought that made me second-guess conversations I'd had with neighbors I'd previously trusted without hesitation. Pam remained kind but increasingly evasive whenever I asked direct questions about Debbie's history or motivations, always deflecting gently, always changing subjects just slightly too smoothly. I didn't want to suspect her, but the pattern of Debbie's perfectly timed visits during Jake's absences felt too consistent to be coincidence. One afternoon, I mentioned Jake's upcoming trip to only two people, Pam, in passing conversation, and my sister over the phone. 3 days later, Debbie showed up during exactly that window, clipboard ready, timing impeccable. My stomach sank with quiet, uncomfortable certainty about where information was leaking from. I didn't confront Pam directly, not yet, choosing instead to simply stop sharing specific details about our schedule with anyone in the neighborhood. If someone was passing information along, deliberately or not, the safest response was simply controlling what information existed to pass along in the first place. Fines continued accumulating regardless, now totaling over $800 in threatened penalties, none of which we'd paid, all of which sat documented in official-looking letters referencing bylaws Rachel confirmed didn't actually appear anywhere in the association's legitimate, filed governing documents obtained through a public records request. That public records request proved illuminating. The filed bylaws, dated years earlier, contained no provisions for the fine amounts Debbie had been charging, no mention of a compliance officer position at all, and crucially, listed a completely different, much larger board than the skeletal, absent one Harold described. Rachel explained that several original board members had apparently resigned or moved away over the years without ever being formally replaced, leaving Debbie to quietly fill the vacuum herself, unelected, unappointed, simply present and persistent until neighbors assumed her authority was legitimate through sheer repetition and confidence. Armed with this information, I felt something shift from defensive to strategic. This wasn't just about protecting our family anymore. It was about exposing a system that had apparently failed an entire neighborhood, allowing one person's unchecked ambition to masquerade as legitimate governance for years without real oversight. I called a town meeting through the county's community mediation office, a step Rachel suggested as both practical and strategically valuable, creating an official record, inviting other affected families, and forcing Debbie to answer for her authority in a setting she couldn't simply dismiss or walk away from. Word spread quickly once flyers went up, mostly through Nina's efforts and the two other families who'd shared similar stories. Within days, nearly a dozen households confirmed interest in attending, some quietly, some openly relieved someone was finally organizing pushback against years of quiet, individual suffering under Debbie's authority. Debbie, hearing about the meeting through neighborhood grapevine, appeared at our door unannounced that same evening, uncharacteristically flustered, insisting the gathering was unnecessary and offering, for the first time, to reconsider our outstanding fines entirely, a dramatic reversal from her position just days earlier. I recognized the shift immediately. This wasn't generosity, it was fear. Someone accustomed to unchallenged authority was suddenly facing the possibility of real scrutiny, and her carefully constructed image was showing its first genuine cracks. However small, however quickly she tried covering them with forced, unconvincing politeness, I declined her offer, calmly explaining that the meeting would proceed regardless, that documentation existed, that other families had similar stories worth hearing. Collectively rather than resolved individually and quietly, the exact pattern that had allowed this situation to continue unchecked for as long as it apparently had. Her expression hardened again, the brief flash of worry replaced by something colder, more calculating. "You're making a mistake," she said before leaving, a phrase that felt less like warning and more like promise, though I didn't yet know exactly what form her next move might take. That night, Jake flew home unexpectedly early, citing a schedule change at work, though something in his voice suggested deliberate timing rather than coincidence. He wanted to be present for whatever came next, a decision that would matter more than either of us fully realized at the time. 2 days before our scheduled meeting, an anonymous complaint reached the County Code Enforcement Office regarding our property, alleging unsafe structural conditions in our backyard swing set, the same swing set Debbie had unsuccessfully tried removing months earlier through entirely different, informal channels within the neighborhood itself. An inspector arrived, found nothing wrong whatsoever, and mentioned, almost offhandedly, that the complaint had come from someone identifying themselves only as a concerned community compliance representative. Language suspiciously specific, suspiciously consistent with exactly how Debbie described her own self-appointed role throughout every prior interaction we documented. I added this incident to our growing file, now thick enough to require its own dedicated binder, organized chronologically with dates, photographs, recordings, and public records all cross-referenced carefully. Exactly the kind of methodical preparation Jake's work had apparently trained him to value deeply, even in personal matters. Rachel reviewed the entire binder over coffee one afternoon, flipping through pages with visible surprise at how comprehensive it had become. "This isn't just a neighbor dispute anymore," she said finally. "Depending what else surfaces, this could mean real legal consequences for her, well beyond community embarrassment." That phrase, "real legal consequences," settled something unsettled in me. For months, I felt like the reactive party, constantly defending our family against escalating, confusing accusations. For the first time, I felt genuinely prepared, organized, and quietly confident that the coming meeting might actually shift the entire dynamic. The night before the meeting, couldn't sleep, running through every scenario, every question I planned to ask, every piece of evidence I intended to present. Jake, lying beside me, squeezed my hand gently. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said quietly, "you've already done the hardest part." The community meeting drew nearly 40 residents, far more than I'd expected, filling the small clubhouse room with quiet, anxious energy. Debbie arrived late, composed again, greeting people with practiced warmth as though the tense confrontation at our door days earlier had never actually happened at all. I presented our documentation carefully, methodically, letting facts speak without embellishment. The fake meeting minutes, Harold's confusion, the towing incident, the mysterious anonymous complaints timed suspiciously with Jake's absences. The room grew progressively quieter, several neighbors exchanging uncomfortable glances as pieces started connecting for everyone simultaneously. Nina and the other affected families shared their own stories afterward, echoing familiar patterns: arbitrary fines, threatened liens, selective enforcement, and a pervasive sense that pushing back against Debbie always resulted in swift, disproportionate retaliation rather than reasonable, good faith conversation about legitimate community concerns or rules. Debbie, cornered by mounting collective testimony, shifted tactics entirely, adopting a softer, almost apologetic tone. She admitted miscommunications had occurred, promised a full review of outstanding fines, and suggested forming an actual, properly elected board moving forward, a suggestion that drew cautious, surprised approval from the room. I watched her carefully during this apparent concession, noting how quickly her demeanor shifted from cornered to conciliatory, how smoothly she pivoted without ever directly acknowledging the forged-seeming documents or admitting genuine wrongdoing. It felt less like accountability and more like damage control performed skillfully under pressure. The meeting ended with cautious optimism among most attendees, relief that finally, collectively, something might change. I felt something different, though, a nagging unease that Debbie's sudden cooperation was strategic rather than sincere, a temporary retreat rather than genuine surrender of the control she'd built so carefully. Jake shared my skepticism afterward, walking to our car in the parking lot. "People like that don't just stop," he said quietly. "They regroup." Though for a few days afterward, life did genuinely seem calmer. Notices stopped arriving, and the neighborhood settled into unfamiliar, tentative peace. Fines were quietly waived within a week, exactly as promised, formal letters arriving with unexpected efficiency. Other affected families reported similar resolutions, their own outstanding penalties disappearing just as smoothly. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe maybe accountability really had worked. Maybe the confrontation had genuinely changed things. Sophie's swing set remained untouched. No further complaints materialized. And even Debbie's morning walks seemed to shift routes, avoiding our street entirely for nearly 2 weeks straight. I began relaxing slightly, though some quiet part of me stayed alert, unable to fully release months of accumulated vigilance and suspicion. Pam mentioned, during a casual conversation, that Debbie had been asking around about forming that promised elected board, gathering names, discussing timelines with genuine seeming enthusiasm. It sounded encouraging on the surface, though something about Pam's tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced of the sincerity behind it either. Rachel advised us to keep documenting regardless, reminding us gently that legal patterns matter more than temporary behavior shifts, especially when someone had demonstrated willingness to forge documents and manipulate an elderly board member's confused memory for personal advantage over an extended period of time already established clearly. I heeded that advice, continuing to note dates, save correspondence, and stay alert even as daily life gradually normalized. Jake's travel schedule returned to its usual rhythm, though this time I noticed he'd started mentioning his trips only briefly, vaguely, an intentional caution neither of us discussed directly. 2 weeks into the calm, I overheard 2 neighbors discussing something odd. Debbie had been seen leaving the county records office downtown, an unusual location for someone supposedly focused entirely on neighborhood matters. Curious rather than alarmed, I filed the detail away without immediately understanding its potential significance. That same week, Harold mentioned during a brief chat that Debbie had visited him privately, asking detailed questions about the original HOA formation documents from decades earlier, questions that seemed oddly specific for someone simply organizing a new community board election as she'd publicly promised everyone at the meeting. I didn't know yet what Debbie was actually planning behind her newfound calm exterior, but every instinct told me the piece was temporary, deliberately constructed, and that whatever came next would prove far more calculated than anything she'd attempted before facing that room full of finally unified, skeptical neighbors. The illusion of peace shattered exactly 17 days after the meeting, when a certified letter arrived announcing a special board election scheduled. With barely a week's notice, buried deep in fine print most residents likely never noticed tucked into their community newsletter mailing that same week. I attended, curious after everything Rachel had warned about, and found the small meeting room populated almost entirely by unfamiliar faces, supposed concerned homeowners I'd never once seen at community events, gatherings, or even casual neighborhood interactions throughout our 2 years living in Maple Ridge Estates. Debbie, presiding confidently, guided the group through a swift, informal vote, and within 20 minutes, announced a newly elected board consisting of herself as president and 3 others I later learned were her cousin, a longtime personal friend, and a coworker from her part-time retail job downtown. Nobody from our original documentation group had received adequate notice. Several attendees admitted afterward they'd only learned about the election accidentally,
through word of mouth. Far too late to properly organize opposition or even question the suspiciously rushed timeline surrounding the entire suddenly announced proceeding.
Rachel, hearing the details, immediately flagged serious legal concerns, inadequate notice periods, questionable voter eligibility, and a board composition that conveniently consolidated total control under people personally loyal to Debbie rather than genuinely representative of the broader, diverse community actually living in Maple Ridge Estates. Armed with her new official board, Debbie's confidence returned sharply, sharper than before. Within days, aggressive notices resumed, targeting specifically the families who'd spoken at our earlier meeting, Nina first, receiving a shockingly large retroactive fine covering violations supposedly occurring over the previous 18 months entirely. I called Nina immediately upon hearing, finding her frightened and furious in equal measure. The fine total, nearly $3,000, threatened genuine financial hardship for her young family. It felt less like coincidence and more like calculated retaliation against the very people who dared challenge Debbie's authority publicly. Rachel filed a formal public records request for the association's complete financial history, a right guaranteed under state HOA transparency laws regardless of leadership legitimacy questions. The response, delayed repeatedly with vague excuses, finally arrived nearly 3 weeks later, heavily redacted and conspicuously incomplete in several crucial sections. What remained visible, however, proved deeply troubling. A separate account, opened roughly 18 months earlier under Debbie's name alone, receiving regular transfers labeled vaguely as administrative fees totaling over $11,000, funds that never appeared anywhere within the association's legitimate, publicly filed operating budget documentation. Rachel's expression, usually calm and measured, shifted noticeably reviewing these numbers. "This isn't just overreach anymore," she said carefully. "If these transfers can't be properly accounted for through legitimate association expenses, we're potentially looking at embezzlement, a serious criminal matter well beyond typical HOA governance disputes." That revelation changed everything. This wasn't simply an overzealous neighbor enforcing invented rules anymore. This was someone potentially diverting community funds for personal benefit while simultaneously punishing anyone who questioned her authority, using fabricated bylaws and manipulated documents to justify an elaborate, sustained financial scheme. I struggled sleeping that night, mind racing through implications. Jake, home briefly, listened carefully to every detail, his expression growing increasingly focused, methodical, the specific intensity one now recognized from watching him quietly, patiently building understanding before ever taking decisive, calculated action toward any serious problem. 2 days later, something happened that shifted the entire situation from financial concern into genuine fear. A caseworker from State Child Protective Services arrived unannounced at our door, citing an anonymous complaint alleging Sophie was frequently left unsupervised while I worked from home distracted by other matters. My heart dropped immediately, panic flooding through me even as I invited the caseworker inside, cooperating fully, showing Sophie playing safely in the living room, explaining our daily routine in careful, trembling detail. The caseworker, professional and measured, assured me this was standard protocol for any complaint received. The visit lasted nearly an hour, the caseworker reviewing our home, asking Sophie gentle age-appropriate questions, checking basic safety conditions throughout. Everything, unsurprisingly, appeared completely normal, prompting her to note the complaint seemed likely unfounded, though official procedure required documentation regardless of how the situation ultimately resolved formally. After she left, I collapsed onto our couch, shaking, Sophie curled beside me, confused by my tears. Jake, hearing everything over the phone that evening, went completely silent for several long seconds. A silence heavier and more dangerous than anything I'd heard from him throughout this entire drawn-out ordeal. "She went after our daughter," he finally said, voice low and controlled in a way that somehow frightened me more than shouting would have. I didn't need him to specify who she meant. We both already knew, without proof yet, exactly who'd likely made that anonymous, devastating complaint. Rachel confirmed the following day, through a records request, that the CPS complaint originated from an IP address linked to a computer registered at the Maple Ridge Clubhouse, the very building where Debbie now held her official board meetings using association equipment for what appeared to be deeply personal purposes. That detail, small but damning, connected directly back to Pam's earlier comment about Debbie's own daughter, taken away young, never mentioned again. I asked Rachel, hesitantly, whether public records might explain that history further, wondering if understanding Debbie's past might illuminate this disturbing, escalating pattern of behavior. Rachel's search revealed something unexpected. Nearly 15 years earlier, Debbie had lost custody of her own young daughter following a lengthy CPS investigation, one involving allegations she'd always publicly denied, claiming a vindictive neighbor had falsely reported her out of jealousy over a property dispute eerily similar to ours. The parallel struck me immediately, unsettling and clarifying simultaneously. Whether Debbie genuinely believed her own past innocence or not, something about watching another young family thrive nearby seemed to trigger deep, unresolved anger, channeling itself into control, surveillance, and now, devastatingly, weaponized false allegations against my own daughter. Understanding her possible motivation didn't excuse anything, but it did clarify the pattern's intensity, explaining why our family specifically had become such a fixated target compared to others who'd simply paid fines quietly and moved on without ever triggering this deeper, more personal, more dangerous level of retaliation. Jake flew home again, this time without any pretense about work scheduling, staying indefinitely while we regrouped strategically. Together with Rachel, we began compiling everything into a formal complaint package: financial irregularities, fraudulent board elections, forged documents, and now, a potentially retaliatory false CPS report targeting our daughter directly. Rachel suggested involving the state's HOA regulatory division alongside local law enforcement, given the combination of financial fraud allegations and what increasingly looked like a deliberate pattern of harassment specifically targeting families who challenged Debbie's authority publicly during our earlier community meeting months before. Meanwhile, Nina's fine remained unresolved, and 2 additional families reported receiving similarly inflated retroactive charges, all conveniently issued by Debbie's newly installed Loyalist board within days of our original documentation meeting, suggesting deliberate, coordinated retaliation rather than any legitimate, good-faith community governance decision whatsoever. I reached out to Pam again, carefully, testing whether she might know anything more about the mysterious information leaks that had plagued us for months. This time, she admitted something new. Debbie had, for years, maintained access to a shared neighborhood app originally created for package deliveries and lost pets. That app, turned out, included a presence feature many residents had unknowingly left enabled, showing rough activity patterns whenever someone posted updates about travel, deliveries, or daily routines. Debbie had apparently studied these patterns closely, explaining her uncanny timing around Jake's absences without needing any human informant at all. Relief mixed with fresh unease upon learning this. Relief that Pam hadn't betrayed us. Unease realizing how thoroughly, methodically Debbie had studied our lives through means we'd never considered vulnerable. It reinforced Jake's earlier observation. This wasn't impulsive behavior, but calculated, patient, deliberately sustained surveillance over many months. With this new understanding, Rachel adjusted our complaint filing, adding evidence of surveillance-adjacent behavior alongside financial and custody-related allegations. The picture emerging felt less like an overzealous neighbor and more like someone using every available tool, legitimate or otherwise, to maintain control over people she'd decided deserved punishment. Debbie, apparently sensing growing organized resistance again, escalated further rather than retreating this time. A new notice arrived threatening formal legal action against our family for harassment of an HOA official, an almost laughable inversion of reality that Rachel confirmed was likely intended purely to intimidate rather than genuinely litigate. I felt something shift inside me reading that notice, moving past fear into something closer to steady resolve. Months of anxiety, documentation, and careful patience had built toward this moment, and rather than retreating under her latest threat, our family finally felt genuinely prepared to meet it directly. Jake began working remotely from home entirely, something his employer apparently approved without hesitation once he explained the situation. Another small detail that quietly hinted at resources and flexibility beyond what typical traveling salesmen usually enjoyed, though I remained too consumed by everything else to question it deeply yet. Together, we hosted a smaller, more targeted gathering with Nina and the other affected families, focusing specifically on building a unified formal complaint rather than another public meeting Debbie could potentially manipulate or disrupt through her newly installed Loyalist Board's procedural influence over community gatherings and communications. Rachel helped draft individual statements from each affected family, careful and specific, avoiding speculation while clearly documenting dates, dollar amounts, and communications received from Debbie or her associates throughout the escalating dispute spanning nearly 8 months since our family first moved into Maple Ridge Estates. The combined package grew substantial. Forged meeting minutes, unauthorized bank transfers, a sham election lacking proper notice, retaliatory fines against multiple families, and a deeply troubling anonymous CPS complaint traced back to association property, all supporting a pattern impossible to dismiss as simple neighborhood misunderstanding or overreach. Rachel submitted everything simultaneously to the state's HOA Oversight Division and, separately, to local police regarding the potential financial fraud, explaining that parallel. Investigations often moved faster when multiple agencies recognized overlapping, corroborating evidence rather than handling isolated pieces of a much larger, interconnected pattern. Debbie, unaware yet of the formal filing, continued escalating locally, posting notices throughout the neighborhood accusing certain families of spreading malicious rumors designed to undermine legitimate community leadership, language clearly aimed at discrediting us preemptively before any official investigation could even properly begin its review process. Several neighbors, previously quiet, began reaching out privately, expressing growing discomfort with Debbie's increasingly defensive, aggressive public posture. The community's overall mood shifted palpably. Uncertainty and suspicion replacing the trust Debbie had spent years carefully cultivating through confident, unchallenged assertions of authority nobody had seriously questioned until now. I received a call from Harold, sounding shaken, admitting he'd finally reviewed the special election documents closely and realized his own signature had been used. Without his knowledge on several forms, he had no memory of ever actually signing, echoing the exact confusion he'd expressed months earlier during our formal hearing. Rachel added Harold's statement immediately to our growing complaint package. Another elderly, previously trusting board member whose identity Debbie had apparently used freely to legitimize documents and decisions he'd never actually authorized. A pattern suggesting far more extensive manipulation than even our earlier suspicions had accounted for. Meanwhile, the county's HOA Oversight Division confirmed receipt of our complaint, opening a formal preliminary review, a process Rachel explained would take weeks but represented genuine institutional traction after months of feeling like we were fighting an invisible, unaccountable system entirely alone within our own neighborhood. Debbie, sensing shifting ground beneath her despite not yet knowing specifics, grew visibly more erratic in public interactions, snapping at neighbors over minor comments, issuing new fines almost daily, and appearing less like a confident authority figure and more like someone desperately trying to maintain control slipping steadily away. I watched this transformation from my kitchen window one afternoon, Debbie arguing loudly with another neighbor over something trivial, gesturing sharply, voice carrying across the cul-de-sac in ways it never had before. Whatever composure had defined her earlier confrontations seemed to be cracking under pressure she couldn't fully explain. Jake, watching beside me, said quietly, "People unravel differently under pressure. Some get quiet." I didn't fully understand the weight behind his observation yet, though I would soon learn just how literally, dangerously reckless Debbie was actually capable of becoming once truly cornered. That same week, an official letter arrived from the county requesting additional documentation to support the ongoing investigation. A request Rachel handled swiftly, submitting supplementary evidence including bank statement excerpts, forged signature comparisons, and recorded conversations establishing a clear, sustained pattern extending well beyond isolated incidents. Debbie, apparently learning through informal channels that something official was underway, though not yet knowing full details, appeared at our door again unannounced, her composure notably absent this time, replaced by barely controlled agitation as she demanded to know what lies we'd been spreading about her. I stayed calm, deliberately, refusing to confirm or deny specifics, simply stating that any concerns should be directed through appropriate official channels rather than confrontations at our doorstep. Her frustration visibly deepened, jaw tightening, eyes narrowing in a way that felt genuinely, uncomfortably different from her usual controlled demeanor. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," she said before leaving abruptly. A statement that lingered uncomfortably, foreshadowing something neither Jake nor I could yet fully anticipate, though both of us recognized immediately that whatever calm remained in our neighborhood was rapidly, dangerously dissolving completely. Rachel, informed of this latest interaction, advised increased caution, suggesting we document any further direct confrontations carefully and avoid engaging alone whenever possible. Jake, already protective throughout this ordeal, became even more vigilant, rarely leaving Sophie and me alone during daylight hours whenever Debbie's presence seemed likely nearby. Nina reported similar behavior from Debbie directed toward her own family. Aggressive drive-bys, pointed stares during neighborhood walks, and one instance where Debbie allegedly photographed Nina's children playing in their own front yard without any legitimate reason connected to actual documented HOA business or community oversight. The combined weight of these incidents, submitted as supplementary evidence, prompted the county investigator to schedule an in-person interview with our family and several others directly, a significant step forward Rachel described as unusually swift given typical bureaucratic timelines for similar HOA oversight investigations statewide. I felt something like hope returning cautiously, tempered heavily by continued anxiety about what Debbie, increasingly unpredictable and clearly aware something serious was unfolding around her, might attempt next before any official consequences could actually materialize and formally, meaningfully restrain her continued, escalating behavior toward our family. Jake, sensing the same uneasy tension building toward some inevitable confrontation, began quietly making his own preparations, though he remained frustratingly vague about specifics whenever I asked directly, simply reassuring me that everything happening was, in his words, moving exactly toward where it needed to go. After Debbie's ominous parting words, Jake quietly installed a small security camera system covering our driveway, backyard, and front porch, something he insisted on doing himself that same weekend, moving with an efficiency that again suggested experience far beyond casual home improvement projects handled by typical exhausted homeowners. Within days, the cameras proved their worth. Footage captured Debbie's car slow-rolling past our house at nearly 11 at night, pausing directly in front for almost a full minute before continuing on. No plausible explanation existing for that timing beyond deliberate, unsettling surveillance of our sleeping household. I felt genuinely frightened reviewing that footage. The first time this entire ordeal had crossed clearly from frustrating harassment into something approaching real, physical danger. Jake forwarded the clip immediately to Rachel and, separately, to the county investigator handling our ongoing complaint against Debbie and her associates. 2 nights later, motion alerts triggered again, this time showing Debbie approaching our trash cans directly, opening the lid carefully, and placing something small and dark inside before quickly walking away, glancing repeatedly over her shoulder as though deeply aware of exactly how suspicious her behavior actually appeared. The next morning, I checked cautiously and found, buried near the top of our recycling, an empty liquor bottle we'd never purchased, positioned prominently enough to be immediately noticeable to anyone glancing inside. Exactly the kind of staged evidence someone might use to suggest problematic behavior to outside authorities. My hands shook photographing it, understanding immediately what she'd likely intended. Another anonymous complaint, this time potentially alleging substance abuse, built entirely on planted evidence designed to look convincingly incriminating without any actual truth behind it whatsoever. Weaponizing our own trash against our family's reputation and safety. Rachel, reviewing both the footage and photographs, confirmed this represented a significant escalation, potentially crossing into criminal territory regarding evidence tampering and continued harassment. She recommended filing an immediate police report alongside our ongoing civil complaint, formally establishing a documented, escalating pattern of dangerous, Deliberate behavior. The responding officer reviewed our camera footage carefully, taking the liquor bottle as evidence, and noted, seriously, that this behavior alone potentially constituted criminal harassment under state law, separate entirely from any HOA-related civil matters already under review through the county's separate regulatory oversight process. That validation, hearing law enforcement acknowledge the seriousness directly, brought unexpected relief alongside continued anxiety. For months, we'd navigated ambiguous territory between annoying neighbor disputes and genuine threat. Now, finally, official acknowledgement confirmed what we'd increasingly suspected. This had become something far more dangerous than typical community friction. Debbie, apparently unaware police had been involved yet, continued her behavior undeterred. 3 days later, cameras captured her approaching Sophie's swing set directly, examining the support chains closely, adjusting something briefly before leaving quickly, movements deliberate and purposeful in ways that immediately alarmed both Jake and me. Jake inspected the swing set himself the following morning, discovering one chain link had been subtly weakened, nearly invisible to casual observation but clearly compromised. Enough that continued regular use might eventually cause failure, potentially injuring Sophie during ordinary play. We'd never think twice about supervising closely. The realization hit me like ice water. This wasn't just harassment or intimidation anymore. Someone had deliberately, calculatedly created conditions potentially dangerous to my 3-year-old daughter's physical safety, crossing a line that transformed every previous fear into something far more visceral, urgent, and genuinely terrifying to comprehend fully. We immediately removed the swing set entirely, photographing the tampered chain extensively before Rachel arranged for it to be examined by an independent engineer, confirming definitively that the damage appeared deliberately caused rather than resulting from normal wear, weather exposure, or any other innocent, accidental explanation whatsoever. This new evidence, combined with everything already compiled, prompted the police to open a formal criminal investigation specifically targeting Debbie, separate from and running parallel to the ongoing HOA fraud review already underway through county regulatory channels examining her broader pattern of governance-related misconduct and financial irregularities. I struggled sleeping properly for days afterward, checking on Sophie repeatedly through the night, jumping at every unfamiliar sound outside our windows. Jake, equally shaken though determined not to show it fully, began sleeping lightly near the front of the house, alert to any further approach toward our property. Nina, hearing about the swing set incident, expressed genuine fear for her own children, prompting several affected families to install their own security cameras and share footage collectively whenever anything suspicious appeared, building an increasingly comprehensive, community-wide documentation network specifically tracking Debbie's continued, escalating behavior throughout the neighborhood. That collective vigilance paid off within a week. When Nina's camera captured Debbie attempting to access her backyard gate late one evening, only retreating after a motion-activated light triggered unexpectedly, illuminating her clearly enough for undeniable facial identification captured across multiple camera angles simultaneously. Rachel forwarded this footage immediately to the investigating officer, strengthening the pattern significantly beyond just our family's individual experience. Multiple households, multiple documented instances of trespassing, tampering, and surveillance, all pointing toward the same person acting with increasingly reckless disregard for legal boundaries or personal consequences. Meanwhile, cracks appeared publicly within Debbie's hastily assembled loyalist board. Her cousin, one of the newly elected members, resigned abruptly citing personal reasons, followed days later by the coworker. Both departures happening quietly but noticeably as legal scrutiny intensified around the entire questionable election and subsequent governance structure. Only Debbie's close friend remained officially associated with the board, though even she began distancing herself publicly, declining to comment when neighbors asked directly about ongoing fines, financial questions, or the increasingly obvious pattern of harassment several families had begun openly discussing throughout Maple Ridge Estates. Debbie, sensing her support system collapsing rapidly around her, grew visibly desperate during this period, appearing disheveled during rare public sightings, snapping harshly at anyone who approached with questions, a stark contrast from the composed, confident authority figure who'd first confronted our family months earlier. One evening, Jake spotted her car parked several houses down, engine running, seemingly watching our home directly for nearly 20 minutes before finally driving away. He called it in immediately, and though officers arrived too late to intercept her, the report added further documentation to our expanding case file. I began fearing for Sophie's safety more acutely than ever, arranging for my mother to stay with us temporarily, providing extra support and supervision while Jake and I focused on navigating the intensifying legal situation alongside basic, exhausting daily life that somehow still needed to continue functioning normally. Rachel informed us the criminal investigation had progressed enough that an arrest warrant application was being prepared, pending final review, covering charges related to trespassing, evidence tampering, and reckless endangerment connected specifically to the swing set incident that had genuinely, seriously threatened Sophie's physical safety. That news brought complicated relief. Knowing accountability finally approached while simultaneously worrying about how Debbie might react once formally confronted with actual criminal charges rather than the informal community pressure she'd successfully deflected or ignored throughout months of escalating, increasingly dangerous behavior toward multiple families. 2 days before the warrant was finalized, Debbie appeared at our door again, this time late evening, her composure completely absent, replaced by raw, unfiltered anger. She accused us directly of destroying her life, insisting everything she'd done had been justified protection of community standards she alone truly understood. I kept the door partially closed, Jake standing protectively beside me, both of us recording the interaction openly this time, no longer concerned about subtlety given how far things had already escalated. "You have no idea what it's like," she said, voice cracking, "watching a family have everything I lost." That admission, however oblique, confirmed everything Rachel's earlier record search had suggested. Debbie's fixation on our family stemmed directly from her own devastating loss years earlier, projected outward with increasing intensity onto anyone who reminded her, consciously or not, of the stable family life she'd once had and lost. Understanding her pain didn't excuse the danger she'd created, though. I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that whatever she'd lost, whatever pain she carried, none of it justified endangering my daughter's physical safety or destroying other families' peace of mind through fraud, harassment, and deliberate sabotage. She left without responding directly, storming back toward her car, nearly stumbling in her haste, glancing back repeatedly with an expression somewhere between fury and something that looked unexpectedly, almost like fear. Jake closed the door quietly, exhaling slowly, both of us shaken by the raw intensity we just witnessed. That interaction, captured clearly on video, became crucial supplementary evidence. Rachel later explained, demonstrating not just pattern but clear motive and continued, escalating instability, strengthening both the criminal case and our parallel civil complaint regarding fraud, harassment, and the broader governance failures throughout the entire Maple Ridge Estates community. The following night, our security cameras captured Debbie's final, most reckless act yet, approaching our property around 2 in the morning carrying what appeared to be a small gas can, moving directly toward our detached garage where Jake's truck sat parked, before a neighbor's dog began barking loudly nearby. Startled by the barking, Debbie fled immediately, dropping the gas can near our property line in her haste, leaving it behind as she disappeared quickly into the darkness, her car peeling away from a spot she'd apparently parked several streets over specifically to avoid detection near our home directly. Jake called police immediately, officers arriving within minutes, collecting the abandoned gas can as evidence alongside our clear camera footage showing Debbie's face, movements, and unmistakable intent captured from multiple angles simultaneously. Evidence far too specific and damning to explain away through any innocent, reasonable interpretation whatsoever. I sat frozen on our couch afterward, adrenaline and terror mixing uncomfortably as the full weight of what might have happened settled slowly over me. Sophie slept upstairs, unaware how close danger had actually come, how far Debbie's obsession and rage had apparently pushed her toward genuinely violent, destructive action. Jake held me tightly that night, both of us awake long after officers left, processing the reality that our neighbor, our supposed community authority figure, had potentially attempted arson against our family's property. Driven by grief, jealousy, and unchecked power finally, catastrophically spiraling completely beyond any remaining rational control. The following morning, the arrest warrant, already in progress, was expedited significantly given this new, serious evidence. Rachel confirmed charges would now include attempted arson alongside trespassing, evidence tampering, reckless endangerment, and the ongoing financial fraud investigation still actively developing through the county's separate regulatory review process. News of the attempted arson spread quickly through Maple Ridge Estates, shocking even neighbors who'd remained skeptical or uninvolved throughout earlier disputes. Community sentiment shifted decisively, sympathy and support flowing toward our family and others affected, while any remaining defenders of Debbie's authority quietly, permanently disappeared entirely. I felt something like validation mixed uncomfortably with lingering fear, understanding intellectually that justice was finally, genuinely approaching while emotionally still, processing how close real danger had actually come to our family's safety throughout this entire drawn-out, increasingly nightmarish ordeal spanning nearly 9 months altogether. Rachel warned us that Debbie, likely aware charges were imminent given the police response to the gas can incident, might attempt something desperate before any formal arrest occurred, advising continued heightened caution and suggesting we consider temporarily relocating Sophie elsewhere until the situation resolved more definitively and safely. Jake refused that suggestion firmly, insisting our family wouldn't be driven from our own home by someone else's unchecked obsession and rage. Instead, he made a different decision that night. One he'd apparently been quietly preparing for weeks, finally revealing exactly why his composure throughout this entire ordeal had never truly wavered. That night, Jake finally told me the truth he'd apparently been withholding out of professional caution. He wasn't simply in compliance for a private company. He worked as a senior investigator for the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division, specializing specifically in cases involving fraud, financial exploitation, and organizational corruption. Everything suddenly made sense. His calm competence during confrontations, his instinct toward careful documentation, his contacts within Rachel's legal network, and his uncanny ability to recognize patterns of manipulation others might have dismissed as ordinary neighborhood friction rather than something far more deliberate and dangerous underneath. I couldn't say anything officially while it might create a conflict, he explained, but I've been coordinating quietly behind the scenes since the embezzlement evidence surfaced. He'd been in contact with both the County HOA Oversight Division and, more recently, detectives handling the escalating criminal investigation against Debbie directly. I felt a complicated mixture of relief and mild disbelief, realizing my husband's steady, unshakable presence throughout this entire ordeal hadn't simply been personality, but genuine professional expertise quietly guiding our family's response strategically while I'd focused primarily on documentation and simply surviving each escalating incident emotionally. Jake explained that detectives now believed Debbie, increasingly desperate and unstable following the failed arson attempt, might attempt one final, reckless act before any formal arrest occurred, possibly targeting our family directly given the deeply personal nature her obsession had clearly taken throughout these past several months. Rather than hiding or relocating, Jake proposed working directly with detectives to establish careful, monitored security around our home, essentially allowing normal daily life to continue visibly while law enforcement remained closely positioned nearby, ready to respond immediately should Debbie attempt any further dangerous escalation against our family. I felt frightened accepting this plan initially, worried about Sophie's safety above everything else. But Jake assured me detectives would maintain constant, discreet surveillance, and that Sophie herself would stay safely with my mother at a relative's house nearby until the situation resolved definitively. One way or another, detectives arrived quietly the following afternoon, briefing us thoroughly on protocol, communication signals, and exactly how they intended monitoring the situation without alerting Debbie to increased police presence, hoping she might reveal her final intentions clearly enough to justify immediate arrest once she made her next inevitable move. Jake, drawing on his professional experience, helped detectives review our entire documentation timeline once more, identifying specific patterns suggesting Debbie typically acted during evening hours, often coinciding with moments she believed our family was most vulnerable or unsupervised based on her months of careful, obsessive observation. Rachel, informed of the coordinated plan, expressed cautious support, emphasizing that any resolution needed to prioritize our family's safety absolutely above all other considerations, including the broader financial fraud case that, while important, mattered far less than ensuring Debbie's escalating instability never actually harmed anyone physically. That evening, with Sophie safely away and detectives positioned discreetly nearby, our house sat quiet, lights dimmed normally, everything appearing exactly as it would on Any ordinary evening despite the careful, tense preparation happening invisibly around us, waiting to see whether Debbie would actually take the bait unknowingly presented. Hours passed without incident, tension building steadily as darkness deepened fully. I sat beside Jake, hands trembling slightly despite his reassuring presence. Both of us listening carefully for any unusual sound outside while trying to maintain some semblance of normal behavior for the benefit of anyone watching closely. Around 10 that night, a detective's radio crackled quietly, confirming Debbie's car had been spotted leaving her home, driving in a direction consistent with heading toward Maple Ridge Estates rather than anywhere else she might reasonably be traveling that late on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday evening. My heart pounded steadily as minutes stretched agonizingly. Jake's hand finding mine in the dim living room, both of us waiting silently while detectives coordinated positions outside, careful to remain unseen while staying close enough to respond immediately should Debbie's approach turn genuinely physically dangerous toward our property. Headlights briefly illuminated our street, slowing near our driveway before continuing past, circling the block once, twice, clearly reconnaissance behavior consistent with everything detectives had anticipated based on Debbie's established, increasingly erratic pattern of surveillance and escalating confrontation throughout the previous several months of documented harassment. On her third pass, her car finally stopped, parking several houses down exactly as it had during previous incidents, engine cutting off completely, leaving the street eerily quiet except for distant crickets and the occasional soft crackle of detective radios communicating quietly, from their carefully concealed surveillance positions. I watched through a narrow gap in our curtains, breath held tightly, as a figure emerged from the parked car, moving deliberately toward our property carrying something. I couldn't quite identify clearly from this distance, my stomach tightening with fear despite knowing detectives remained positioned closely, ready to intervene. Jake squeezed my hand firmly, his expression focused and calm despite the obvious tension radiating through his tightened jaw. The specific composed intensity one now understood came from genuine professional experience navigating exactly these kinds of dangerous, carefully monitored situations throughout his actual career investigating fraud and corruption. The figure approached steadily, pausing briefly near our mailbox before continuing directly toward our front porch. Movements careful and deliberate, clearly unaware that multiple detectives watched closely from concealed positions across the street. Radio silent now, everyone waiting for the precise, appropriate moment to finally intervene decisively. My phone buzzed silently, a message from the lead detective confirming they had clear visual confirmation and would move in the moment any criminal action occurred. Reassuring but doing little to calm the overwhelming anxiety flooding through me as I watched Debbie's silhouette grow closer to our home. She reached our porch steps, and I could see now she carried what appeared to be a small container, similar in size to the gas can from before, along with something else clutched tightly in her other hand that I couldn't identify clearly through the narrow gap in our curtains. Jake, positioned carefully near our doorway but staying back as detectives had instructed, watched intently, his professional training clearly guiding every controlled, deliberate movement despite the very personal, very real danger this moment represented for our own family's immediate safety within our own supposedly secure home. Debbie set the container down carefully near our door, and for a horrifying moment, I thought she might actually attempt lighting something directly against our house while we remained inside. Panic surging through me despite Jake's calm reassurance that detectives would intervene the instant any genuine danger materialized. Instead, she knelt down, pulling something from her pocket. Not a lighter, but what appeared to be a folded piece of paper, which she began taping directly to our front door. Movements strangely methodical despite everything else about tonight suggesting complete, dangerous desperation driving her continued actions forward. Detectives, watching this shift in behavior closely, held their position momentarily rather than moving in immediately, waiting to see exactly what she intended before intervening, careful not to escalate prematurely if her current actions, however strange, didn't yet constitute clear, immediate physical danger justifying instant arrest. I strained to read the paper through the window once she finished, though the dim porch light made it difficult, catching only fragments, something about final warning, and you'll regret exposing me, language consistent with the same escalating threats she'd made verbally during previous confrontations throughout recent months. Debbie straightened up afterward, reaching again toward the container she'd placed earlier, and this time, detectives moved decisively, emerging swiftly from their concealed positions across the street, calling out clear, authoritative commands that shattered the tense silence completely, catching Debbie visibly, genuinely startled and unprepared entirely. She froze immediately, container still in hand, eyes widening with shock as multiple officers approached rapidly from multiple directions, clearly having had no idea whatsoever that her supposedly private, carefully planned late-night visit had actually been anticipated, monitored, and precisely intercepted throughout its entire unfolding sequence. Jake opened our front door calmly the moment officers secured the immediate area, stepping outside deliberately, standing directly in Debbie's line of sight for the first time that evening. Her expression shifted instantly from shock toward something resembling genuine, dawning horror as recognition settled slowly across her features. "You," she said quietly, voice barely audible, staring at Jake with an expression I'd never seen from her before. Not anger, not defiance, but genuine, unmistakable fear finally registering as she realized exactly who she'd been dealing with throughout this entire escalating, increasingly reckless campaign against our family. Officers secured the container immediately, confirming it contained accelerant consistent with the earlier attempted arson evidence, alongside the threatening note now collected as additional criminal evidence. Debbie stood motionless, handcuffs finally clicking into place, her carefully constructed image of neighborhood authority collapsing completely in that single, decisive moment. As officers led her toward a waiting patrol car, she glanced back one final time toward our house, toward Jake standing calmly on our porch, and toward me watching from our doorway. Finally, fully understanding that the family she'd spent months trying to destroy had actually been ready for her all along. The neighborhood, alerted by flashing lights and radio chatter, began emerging cautiously from their homes, watching in stunned silence as Debbie Voss, their self-appointed HOA authority for years, was placed formally under arrest directly in front of the very house she'd spent months relentlessly, unjustly targeting. Nina arrived within minutes, drawn by commotion, standing beside me as officers loaded Debbie into the patrol car. "It's really over," she whispered, disbelief evident in her voice after months of shared fear, documentation, and quiet solidarity against someone who'd controlled their neighborhood through manufactured authority and fear. Jake finally explained openly to gathering neighbors, briefly and professionally, that tonight's arrest connected directly to an ongoing state investigation into financial fraud, forged documents, and escalating harassment, information that spread quickly through hushed, shocked conversations rippling across Maple Ridge Estates within minutes of Debbie's departure. Harold approached slowly, leaning on his cane, visible relief mixing with obvious guilt across his weathered features. "I should have questioned things sooner," he admitted quietly. I squeezed his shoulder gently, telling him honestly that Debbie's manipulation had clearly exploited trust deliberately, not carelessness on his part whatsoever. Detectives remained afterward, collecting statements from several neighbors who'd witnessed tonight's events, while Rachel arrived shortly after receiving Jake's call, immediately beginning coordination between tonight's criminal arrest and our ongoing parallel civil complaint regarding the broader financial fraud and fraudulent board election still under active investigation. I finally allowed myself to cry. Relief and exhaustion overwhelming months of accumulated fear. Standing on our porch surrounded by neighbors who'd become genuine allies throughout this ordeal. Jake wrapped his arms around me tightly, whispering that Sophie would finally, truly be safe returning home permanently. My mother brought Sophie home the following morning, unaware of specifics but sensing the shift in atmosphere immediately, hugging me tightly as Sophie ran happily toward her rebuilt swing set, oblivious to how close danger had actually come throughout this exhausting, terrifying chapter of our family's life. News of Debbie's arrest spread rapidly beyond Maple Ridge Estates within days. A local reporter picking up the story after speaking with several affected families, publishing details about forged HOA documents, embezzled community funds, and a pattern of harassment that had apparently continued unchecked for years before finally, genuinely being exposed. The article prompted additional families, some who'd moved away years earlier after similar experiences, to contact Rachel directly, sharing their own stories of arbitrary fines, threatened liens, and unexplained conflicts with Debbie dating back far longer than any of us currently living in the neighborhood had previously realized. One woman, contacted through the article, confirmed something that finally, completely explained Pam's earlier hesitation. She'd been Debbie's actual neighbor years earlier, during the original custody dispute, and confirmed the CPS complaint against her had indeed been entirely fabricated, motivated purely by a petty property disagreement escalated dangerously. That revelation added crucial context to the ongoing criminal case, establishing a documented pattern spanning over a decade of similar behavior, manufactured complaints, financial manipulation, and escalating harassment against multiple families who'd simply lived nearby, someone increasingly, dangerously fixated on controlling everyone around her completely. Rachel confirmed the county's HOA Oversight Division had officially invalidated Debbie's entire Loyalist board, restoring proper governance procedures and scheduling a legitimate, properly noticed election open to all homeowners, finally restoring genuine democratic process to an association that had quietly, informally operated under unchecked control for years. Nina, encouraged by growing community support, agreed to run for board president herself, a decision that felt fitting given everything she'd endured and the genuine leadership she'd demonstrated organizing affected families throughout months of uncertainty, documentation, and eventually Successful collective resistance against Debbie's manipulative authority. I attended the arraignment hearing days later alongside Jake, Nina, and several other affected families, watching Debbie appear before a judge, visibly diminished from the confident authority figure who'd once terrorized our neighborhood through fabricated rules and manufactured fear disguised carefully as legitimate community oversight and enforcement. Charges formally included attempted arson, evidence tampering, criminal harassment, embezzlement, and forgery, spanning both the immediate incidents against our family and the broader pattern eventually documented affecting multiple households throughout Maple Ridge estates over several years of unchecked, escalating authority abuse and financial manipulation. The prosecutor, reviewing everything Jake and Rachel had meticulously compiled, noted publicly that this represented one of the more thoroughly documented HOA fraud and harassment cases the county had encountered, crediting our family's careful, sustained documentation efforts as crucial toward building an ultimately undeniable, comprehensive case. Debbie's attorney requested bail, which the judge granted with strict conditions, including a mandatory no-contact order preventing any communication whatsoever with our family or the other affected households throughout the neighborhood, alongside electronic monitoring pending trial proceedings scheduled for several months later that year. Walking out of the courthouse that afternoon, I felt something shift permanently inside me. Months of accumulated fear finally beginning to loosen their grip, replaced gradually by cautious relief and the slow, unfamiliar process of imagining life without constant vigilance against Debbie's next unpredictable, escalating move. Jake, walking beside me, finally opened up more fully about his professional background, explaining he'd specifically requested involvement facilitating our case once realizing the pattern's severity. Though he'd carefully maintained appropriate boundaries preventing any conflict of interest throughout the official investigation process handled by dedicated detectives. I couldn't just watch as your husband and do nothing professionally useful, he admitted quietly. But I also couldn't let my job compromise how the case actually got built. That balance, I realized, explained perfectly why he'd remained so steady throughout everything, guiding without ever overstepping appropriate boundaries. Over following weeks, the embezzlement investigation revealed the full scope of Debbie's financial manipulation. Nearly $18,000 diverted from community funds over 3 years, disguised through vague, administrative fee transfers into a personal account she'd used for everything from car payments to a family vacation. That specific detail, a vacation funded partly through stolen community money, struck many neighbors particularly hard, transforming residual sympathy some had felt regarding her difficult personal history into clearer, more justified anger about deliberate, calculated theft disguised carefully behind months of manufactured community authority and control. Rachel filed our family's formal civil complaint shortly afterward, seeking damages related to the towing costs, threatened liens, emotional distress from the false CPS complaint, and property damage stemming from the tampered swing set incident that had genuinely, seriously endangered Sophie's physical safety throughout this ordeal. Nina and 2 other affected families joined similar civil complaints, Rachel coordinating everything efficiently given the overlapping evidence already established through the criminal investigation, streamlining what might otherwise have become years of separate, exhausting individual legal battles into a more unified, manageable collective process. Community sentiment throughout Maple Ridge estates shifted dramatically during this period. Neighbors who'd previously stayed quietly compliant now openly discussing their own past experiences, creating an unexpected wave of collective healing as people finally safely shared stories they'd suppressed for years out of fear or exhaustion. Harold, still processing guilt over his unknowingly forged signatures, became unexpectedly active in organizing the upcoming legitimate board election, determined to help rebuild proper governance structures, ensuring nothing similar could ever happen again without proper oversight, transparency, and genuine democratic accountability throughout the community's future leadership. Sophie, blissfully unaware of most specifics, simply enjoyed her rebuilt swing set and newfound freedom playing outside without the constant undercurrent of tension that had quietly shaped our family's daily life for nearly 9 months. Throughout this entire exhausting ordeal we'd finally begun genuinely putting behind us, I found myself reflecting often during quiet evenings on everything that had unfolded. How a simple mailbox comment months earlier had eventually revealed embezzlement, forgery, attempted arson, and a devastating personal history explaining, though never excusing, the depth of Debbie's calculated, sustained campaign against our family specifically. Jake and I discussed occasionally whether we'd made the right choice staying and fighting rather than simply moving away like other affected families had done years earlier.
Always concluding that our persistence had ultimately protected not just our own family, but an entire neighborhood from continued exploitation.
Rachel mentioned, during one final consultation, that our case had already prompted discussion within state legislative circles regarding stronger HOA oversight requirements, particularly around financial transparency and formal accountability measures preventing unelected individuals from accumulating unchecked authority the way Debbie had managed for so many years. That potential broader impact felt meaningful, transforming our personal ordeal into something that might genuinely help protect other families from similar situations. A small but significant silver lining emerging from months of fear, documentation, and eventually, hard-won accountability against someone who'd abused trust so thoroughly. The trial date approached steadily over following months, Rachel preparing us carefully for potential testimony, reviewing every piece of documented evidence methodically, ensuring our family's account remained clear, consistent, and compelling enough to support the broader criminal case alongside everyone else's contributing evidence and testimony. Debbie's attorney attempted several pretrial motions seeking reduced charges, each rejected given the overwhelming, meticulously documented evidence spanning video footage, financial records, forged signatures, and multiple corroborating witness statements establishing an undeniable, sustained pattern impossible to dismiss as isolated incidents or simple misunderstandings. Meanwhile, our neighborhood's legitimate election proceeded successfully, Nina winning decisively as the new HOA president, immediately implementing transparent financial reporting, proper meeting documentation, and clear, publicly available bylaws ensuring nothing similar could ever again develop unnoticed beneath the surface of everyday community life. As the trial finally approached, I felt something like closure settling gradually over our family, understanding that regardless of the specific verdict, the truth had already emerged fully, publicly, and undeniably. Debbie's carefully constructed authority exposed completely as fraud, manipulation, and dangerous, unchecked personal obsession. The trial began on a bright autumn morning, courtroom filled with Maple Ridge residents, several from the article's expanded coverage, and even a few reporters covering what had become a locally notable case about HOA authority abuse and financial corruption within a supposedly ordinary suburban community. I testified carefully, describing the swing set incident, the false CPS complaint, and the mounting fear that had shaped our daily life for months. Staying focused and factual exactly as Rachel had coached. Letting documented evidence rather than raw emotion carry the weight of our family's genuine experience. Jake testified next. Professional and measured despite the deeply personal nature of everything discussed. Explaining the security footage, the tampered swing set chain, and the coordinated evening when detectives finally intercepted Debbie's attempted final confrontation against our family within our own supposedly secure home. Harold's testimony proved particularly powerful. An elderly man visibly emotional describing how his trust and confused memory had been deliberately exploited to legitimize fraudulent documents. His voice cracking slightly as he acknowledged feeling personally responsible for years of unchecked authority granted unknowingly through his own manipulated signature. Nina and 2 other families shared their own experiences, painting a comprehensive picture spanning years rather than months, establishing definitively that our family's ordeal represented merely the most recent, most extreme escalation of a much longer, more troubling pattern Debbie had maintained throughout her entire time in Maple Ridge Estates. The prosecution presented financial records methodically, walking jurors through $18,000 in embezzled funds, forged board documents, and the fraudulent election that had briefly, illegitimately consolidated total control under Debbie's personal authority following our family's initial documentation and organized community pushback months earlier. Debbie's defense argued diminished capacity related to unresolved grief and trauma from losing custody of her own daughter years earlier, a strategy Rachel had anticipated, though the overwhelming physical evidence, video footage, financial records, forged signatures, left little room for reasonable doubt regarding deliberate, sustained intent. During cross-examination, Debbie herself took the stand, and for the first time, spoke publicly about her own history, admitting tearfully that watching families like ours thrive nearby had triggered overwhelming, uncontrollable feelings she'd never properly processed or addressed through appropriate professional support throughout the years following her devastating loss. It was a genuinely difficult moment, hearing real pain beneath everything she'd done, though it didn't diminish the very real, very serious danger she'd created for Sophie and other children throughout the neighborhood through calculated, repeated actions that extended far beyond any reasonable interpretation of unprocessed grief alone. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours, returning with guilty verdicts on nearly every charge: attempted arson, evidence tampering, criminal harassment, forgery, and embezzlement, acknowledging the prosecution's comprehensive, undeniable case built carefully from nearly a year of methodical documentation and coordinated investigative work. Sentencing followed several weeks later, the judge citing both the severity and calculated nature of Debbie's actions, alongside genuine acknowledgement of her difficult personal history, ultimately imposing 4 years in state prison followed by extended probation, alongside mandatory restitution covering every family's documented financial losses throughout the ordeal. Debbie's home, turned out, carried substantial debt she'd apparently accumulated maintaining appearances of authority and stability, and following legal proceedings, was eventually sold to cover restitution payments and mounting legal fees. The same house from which she'd once confidently, wrongly enforced invented rules against everyone else. Watching her led away after sentencing, I felt an unexpected mixture of relief and quiet sadness, understanding that genuine accountability had finally arrived while recognizing how much unresolved pain had apparently fueled such a destructive, sustained campaign against families who'd simply wanted ordinary, peaceful lives within their own homes. Restitution payments began slowly reaching affected families over following months, covering towing fees, fraudulent fines, legal costs, and additional damages related to emotional distress and property tampering, providing tangible, meaningful closure alongside the broader satisfaction of watching genuine justice finally, thoroughly served after months of fear. Nina, now firmly established as our legitimately elected HOA president, implemented lasting structural changes ensuring financial transparency, proper election procedures, and clear communication channels, transforming Maple Ridge Estates into the genuinely welcoming, well-governed community we'd originally hoped for when first moving in years earlier. Harold, finally free from lingering guilt, became an active, engaged board member himself, determined to help rebuild trust throughout the neighborhood while ensuring no future leader could ever again accumulate unchecked authority through quiet manipulation and exploited trust the way Debbie had managed for so long undetected. Pam, turned out, had genuinely been unaware of Debbie's app-based surveillance methods throughout everything, feeling deeply guilty regardless for not pushing harder against Debbie's authority sooner. A guilt I gently reassured her wasn't warranted given how thoroughly, carefully Debbie had manipulated nearly everyone throughout the community. Sophie, now 4 and thriving, remained blissfully unaware of most specifics, simply enjoying her rebuilt swing set, neighborhood friends, and the genuine peace that had gradually, steadily returned to our daily family life following months of quietly managed fear disguised carefully behind ordinary parenting routines and responsibilities. Jake returned to his regular investigative work fully, though he mentioned occasionally how personally meaningful this particular case had become, watching firsthand how patient, methodical documentation could ultimately protect not just his own family, but an entire community from continued, unchecked exploitation and calculated authority abuse. I reflected often on everything we'd learned throughout this ordeal, the importance of documentation, community solidarity, and refusing to simply comply quietly with unjust authority regardless of how confidently, persistently it presented itself as legitimate, unquestionable community governance deserving automatic, unearned respect and compliance. Rachel, reflecting on the case's broader impact, mentioned it had already been referenced during state legislative discussions regarding stronger HOA transparency requirements, suggesting our family's persistence might eventually contribute toward meaningful, systemic protections benefiting other communities facing similar unchecked authority abuse throughout the state. The local reporter who'd originally covered Debbie's arrest published a lengthy follow-up piece detailing the trial's conclusion, interviewing several affected families, including ours, about the entire ordeal's lasting impact and the genuine relief accompanying watching accountability finally thoroughly arrive after years of unchecked, escalating behavior. Neighbors who'd once quietly complied out of fear now spoke openly about their own experiences, creating a genuinely stronger, more connected community bonded partly through shared adversity and the collective relief of finally successfully standing together against someone who'd exploited their individual silence for far too long. Standing in our backyard one quiet evening, watching Sophie push herself higher on her rebuilt swing, laughing freely without any lingering hesitation, I finally allowed myself to fully exhale, understanding that whatever else changed, our family had emerged from this ordeal stronger, more connected, and genuinely, permanently safe again. Nearly a year later, Maple Ridge Estates looked remarkably different, properly maintained records,
Transparent finance,
and a genuine sense of community trust rebuilt gradually through consistent, honest leadership under Nina's continued guidance, replacing years of quiet fear with something closer to authentic neighborly cooperation and respect. Debbie remained incarcerated. Occasional updates reaching us through Rachel regarding restitution progress and her ongoing legal obligations. Information I received now with quiet acknowledgement rather than lingering fear. A distant chapter finally closed rather than an ongoing threat shadowing our family's everyday sense of safety and peace. Sophie started kindergarten that fall, thriving socially and academically, utterly unaware of how close danger had once come during her earliest years, a blessing Jake and I both cherished deeply, grateful our careful documentation and persistence had ultimately protected her innocence throughout the entire frightening ordeal. Our family story occasionally still came up among newer residents moving into Maple Ridge Estates, usually shared as a cautionary tale about unchecked authority, but increasingly also as genuine reassurance that community accountability, patience, and collective courage could successfully overcome even deeply entrenched, seemingly unstoppable patterns of abuse. Jake and I often discussed how the entire ordeal, despite its genuine terror, had ultimately strengthened our marriage and family bond significantly, teaching us both invaluable lessons about patience, documentation, and standing firmly together against injustice regardless of how confidently, persistently it initially presented itself as legitimate authority. Looking back, I understood clearly now that Debbie's downfall hadn't come from any single dramatic confrontation, but from months of quiet, careful persistence, documenting patiently, building community trust gradually, and ultimately allowing the truth, however long delayed, to finally, undeniably speak entirely for itself. Some evenings, watching Sophie play freely in our backyard beneath the same swing set once weaponized against her safety, I think about how easily fear could have driven us away entirely, and how grateful I remain that we chose instead to stay, document, and fight for genuine justice. Maple Ridge Estates today feels exactly like the community we'd originally hoped for when we first moved in, welcoming, honest, and genuinely peaceful, proof that even the most entrenched, unchecked authority eventually collapses beneath the accumulated weight of patient documentation, community solidarity, and simple, undeniable truth. Jake still jokes sometimes that Debbie truly regretted confronting our family the moment Dad actually came home, though we both know real justice took far longer.
Far more patience, and far more courage from an entire community finally choosing, together, to stop quietly complying and start genuinely fighting back.